There are many ways of introducing tone to an etching. Now, of course, the simplest way is to use plate tone, which is effectively just to manipulate the amount of ink you remove from your plate as you're wiping it back. This is okay, but of course you have to consider that if you do use this technique, then it can be quite difficult to replicate that as an addition. So most people are introduced to the Aquatint. The Aquatint's been around for about 200 years, primarily introduced by Goya in a series of etchings. The technique involves, more often than not, the use of rosin. Now, rosin in recent years, people have started to suspect that perhaps it could be slightly hazardous to your health. It's been even suggested that if you inhale rosin into your lungs, it could even be possibly carcinogenic, and it's also obviously highly explosive. So with this in mind, I started to research alternative materials which could be used as an aquatint. And this demonstration is all about the icing sugar aquatint. Now, I've been reliably informed by the medical profession that if you were to inhale icing sugar, it shouldn't have too much of a detrimental effect on you. In fact, it can quite easily be absorbed into the system, as I say, without any ill effects. But before I actually go on to showing you the technique and how to achieve an icing sugar aquatint, I think it's important that we first perhaps talk about the half-tone screen. Now, the half-tone screen is very closely related to the aquatint. The half-tone screen is most often used, of course, in commercial printing. Most of the photography and brochures that you would look at in your day-to-day life will be using the process of the half-tone screen. So for those who perhaps haven't got quite an understanding of what a half-tone screen is, I'd just like to talk a little bit about that initially. It will very much relate to the aquatint because there are certain aspects of the half-tone screen which, as I say, relate to the mechanics of understanding and knowing how you can manipulate the aquatint. Now, the half-tone screen obviously works on the basis, as with most printing, that if a printing machine, whether it's a large commercial press or it's you holding an individual roller, if, for example, you're trying to make a black and white image with the gradation of tones from the deepest black to the lightest grey, how does an inky roller produce all those variations of tone? Well, it's actually achieved effectively by an illusion, because obviously if you're moving that black roller across the surface, then of course it can't determine where you want lighter tones and where you want darker tones. So it does this, as I say, by illusion, by creating the effect of you viewing the image as a gradation of tone, when in fact it's still very tiny lumps of individual ink droplets. If you look at this image here, from the distance you're viewing it at the moment, you will probably view it as a gradation of tone from mid-grey through to virtually black where the pupil is, and the lighter tones on the outside. But as the camera zooms in, you'll see that in fact, as I said earlier, we are actually looking at blobs of ink effectively on the paper. So the illusion is achieved by the size of these individual dots on the paper. So the lighter tones are smaller dots, and as you grade through the tonal range, when you get to the mid-tone, we're looking at effectively a dot which is the same size as the white area. And as you move further through till you get to almost black, most of the area is taken up with the black dot and only very small white dots are remaining. So this illusion is created with solid lumps of ink, and in that way, that's how a half-tone screen works. Now, an aquatint, or a rosin aquatint, works in exactly the same way. It works on the basis that we're looking for the control of a blob of ink sitting in an etched hole, if you like, in the surface of your plate. And the rosin achieves this by effectively creating a resistance between the plate surface and the acid, using this fused lump of rosin. Of course, this is highly magnified, and the spaces between these tiny particles are, if you like, etched away. And the longer that you, of course, etch the plate, not only does the acid go downwards, but it opens up the actual side of the hole which the blob of ink is going to be sitting in. And of course, that's exactly how we get the same effect as the commercial half-tone screen. If you remember, I explained the larger the dot, the darker the tone. So the longer you leave this etched plate into the acid, the deeper but the wider this dot becomes, so the darker the tone is achieved. So you control the amount of tone simply by how long you leave the plate exposed to the acid. Now the icing sugar aquatint works on exactly the same principle. In fact, it's probably more closely related to the half-tone screen. Whereas with the resin aquatint, what you're actually getting is holes made in the surface of the plate which are between these little blobs of ink. That doesn't actually give you dots. If you look at this image here, this is a good representation of the kind of effect that you achieve with a rosin aquatint. Because if you think about it, with a rosin aquatint, you're getting areas which have been protected, little blobs, little holes, aren't exactly being created. It's more about areas between the dots. So you get more of a sort of a squiggly effect, more of a sort of squiggly line that is the acid attacking the plate around those little resin particles. So there's a more of a squiggly effect, and if you look very closely at an aquatint, this is the kind of effect you'll see. So it's not a dot. Now the icing sugar aquatint works more, as I say, closely to a traditional half-tone screen, because in fact what we get are tiny little holes in the surface of the plate. And as I said, it'll make more sense when we come to the actual demonstration, but very quickly, effectively what we're going to get is our plate, which we'll cover with our big ground. When we sprinkle the sugar onto the surface of the wet ground, these tiny particles of icing sugar will sink through the surface of the ground, sit on the surface of the plate. When we then bake the plate, and we then rinse the plate in warm water, these tiny little particles of icing sugar, which have effectively acted a bit like a sponge, have sucked up all the ink ground around them, will then be dissolved in the water, exposing small holes in the plate, which will then allow the acid to pass through, and that's how we get our dots. Now, this is where this relationship around the distance between the dots is very crucial in the understanding of how the aquatint works. If you consider that if we're using large dots to create our tonal range, in other words, from a certain distance, these dots, which are equal distance apart, if you go far enough backwards, if there are enough of these dots, that will appear as a mid-grey. In the same way as these here, these dots are smaller, but if they're equal distance apart, in other words, the distance between them is the same as the size of the dot, again, that will appear as a mid-grey. The only difference between the two, of course, is that you would have to go further back before these individual dots didn't still appear as individual dots, but as a tone. As these dots get larger and they get closer together, then of course, as I've already said, the tone gets much darker. But when we're talking about an aquatint, of course, and we're thinking about the acid eating into the surface of the plate, if we're dealing with large particles that create these dots, then of course the time it takes for the acid to etch away so that these two dots get closer and closer to create these gradations of tone are going to take longer, because the distance between each of these dots is larger, so the acid has to eat away more metal. If we start using particles which are much smaller, even though if they're equal distance apart, it still creates the same tone as this one, because it has less distance to travel, effectively that means in the acid we get darker tones more quickly. So that's why if you're using something like an icing sugar aquatint, because the particles are much, much smaller than the particles in a rosin aquatint, we achieve a black in a much faster process in the acid. So that you have to bear that in mind when you come to perhaps do your first icing sugar aquatint. When you make your step wedge, which I always encourage people to do, to get your gradations of tone, you'll probably find that you can achieve solid black in as little as 15 or 16 minutes. But we'll talk a little bit more about that during the practical demonstration. So the first part of this procedure, as with all processes that involve using BIG, I can't stress more how important it is to make sure that you thoroughly degrease your plate. Of course, you've already beveled the edges to make sure, of course, that your roller isn't damaged when you're applying the ground. But of course, you can see that this plate is obviously very greasy just by the way that the water behaves as it runs down the surface of the plate. So in order to degrease this, I use my mixture of vinegar, salt and water. Give it a bit of a spray and then apply a bit of whiting, like that, and then just rub it in as a paste. And this is a very simple, as I said in the early demonstration, this is a very simple way and safe way of achieving a degreased plate. I think I might need just a little bit more. It's usually the edges that need the most attention for whatever reason. If a plate's been polished, especially if it's been polished with brasso, it can sometimes take a little bit more effort. I'll just rub that in. Just give that a rush. Put it over and see what that looks like now. You can see there now that the water is running down the surface of that plate in a very different way to initially before it was degreased. Still needs a little bit more degreasing in those corners. You can see it's still creeping away from the edge there. So I'll just put a little bit more. It's better to be safe than sorry, I always feel. So I'll just put a little bit more on there. Just to make sure those edges, of course, make sure, as I said before, make sure your fingers don't touch the plate more than they have to, because of course your fingers could be greasy too. And the whiting isn't contaminated with any grit, as it would obviously scratch the plate. There you go, that's better now. It's running down nicely down the whole entire surface of the plate. Okay, now it just needs us to dry this plate using newsprint, and then we can move on then to applying our ground. Now for this part I'm going to use the red ground, of course, but this can be done just as easily with the black ground. Of course, as I always say, make sure that the surface that you're working on is as clean as you can possibly get it. No greasy marks left on the surface, any dust removed. Same with your roller, make sure that's perfectly clean. You can see we don't need a huge amount of ground. Just smooth that out a little bit. And then we'll just roll up. Just raising the roller every now and again so that it spins round and we get a nice even layer of ground rolled out. Sometimes you will get the odd little bit of ground which is hardened, a little bit of skin. If you haven't used it for a little while, take those out. And then we just roll over in exactly the same way as you would for any standard ground for any of the other processes. You don't have to put a thinner layer or a thicker layer, exactly the same. Now of course what I've done here is I've laid a ground on a bare plate, but of course if you are putting an aquatint on an already etched plate, then of course that can be done too. The only thing you might want to do is, if you've already etched lines, by using a roller of course on the plate,
you may still leave some of those lines exposed to etch further. So it may mean you may have to just smudge the plate surface, if there are already lines etched into it, to push some of the ground down into those lines to protect them. You could also use a little squeegee to sort of manipulate more of the ground across the surface of the plate, again pushing it down into those lines before you then roll over the surface to create a nice smooth surface. But we're going to use this plate to create a step wedge so that we can illustrate the time it takes between a light grey and a black. So that's now been covered with our ground, and now we just have to move on to actually applying the icing sugar.